So we might as well just throw it out because it doesn't work on any level whatsoever. Hey guys, welcome to Joel Reads Bible. I'm Joel and I'm reading Bible so that you don't have to. And this is one of our really super fun recap episodes. It's an episode where I talk about the 10 previous chapters and just sort of mention stuff that I maybe didn't catch the first time around and things I noticed while I was editing and going through, and I would go, wait a second, I forgot to mention this. It's going to be pretty fun because we are talking about Exodus 11 to Exodus 20. A lot happens in those 10 chapters. I'm not going to go over everything, of course, because you can always watch the actual chapters. And yeah, I'm wearing a shirt that a lot of people have complimented me on, so you're welcome for that. And you might also notice that the room and the background is going to get darker as the video goes on because the sun is setting. It is just that time of day, and it's not a metaphor for anything, just so you know. That would be impossible because, we're really just at the sunrise of this book. This book is long. It's dawn. Most of the rooster hasn't even crowed 3 times, Jesus. So it's still early days, but the sun will probably set behind me. And this video, I have a feeling, is going to be too long, as my recaps often are. But let me just try to power through. Before we get into it, please subscribe, like, comment on this video. These are the things I always ask you guys to do. Every time I get a comment that says, keep going, I love your stuff, this is really great, it makes my heart warm. It really is encouraging and validating because I do get a lot of the exact opposite comments. You don't know what you're talking about. You're taking things out of context. What a horrible exegesis or whatever. Funnily enough, it's very rare to have somebody correct me and to say, this is why you're wrong. They don't really have that much substance, but they do often like to tell me that I am wrong. So it's really nice to hear those comments when people are like, hey, I actually really like what you're doing. So thank you all for that. Let's get into it. We are talking, of course, first about Exodus chapter 11. So Exodus chapter 11 is the tail end of Israel being in Egypt. It's just before they walk out the door. So we just get a very short chapter kind of reiterating things. So the thing that I brought up while I was doing the chapter, and it's something that I will reiterate here, is what happens in verse 5, where God says he is going to kill the son of the slave girl. And I said that I don't think that that's very nice. I think that that's actually horrific. The slave is a slave. The slave is a victim. The slave is definitely not what people would say, oh, some of these sons were slave drivers. They were cruel to the Israelites, all the rest of it. This is just another slave. And so they're not Hebrew, but that doesn't mean that it's okay to bring absolute anguish and pain and suffering to this slave girl. This brings me to this idea of prescription versus description. When it comes to these horrific things that happen in the Bible, apologists will tell you, well, this is describing the bad thing. It's not prescribing it. It's not like God said, hey, go and do this thing. He's describing what they did. We can think about Tamar and Judah, where Tamar prostituted herself to Judah. Judah slept with the prostitute who was actually his daughter-in-law. She became pregnant, and then he couldn't burn her alive like they had planned to because he was the dad, and so she got away with it, and of course, there was absolutely no consequence or anything wrong with him sleeping with a prostitute. We can look at that and we can say, oh, that looks immoral, right? This seems to be something that a Christian or this God would find as immoral behavior. But he didn't tell them to do that, right? These were just sinful people doing what they do. Anyway, it ends up being a Hebrew folktale that has nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with God, and we can't really blame God because, hey, it's description. In the case of killing the slave girl's son, it's description, but it's description of God doing something horrible. He's not asking anyone else to do something horrible, he's doing it. Why is it not wrong that he does it? What I get from the text is that she's the property of the Egyptian, and the slave's son is the property of the Egyptian, it's going to hurt the Egyptian to lose a slave. God sees them as property. That's what is happening in the text. God is seeing them as property. He doesn't see that they have value in and of themselves. Their life is not that important, but hey, I can sock it to these Egyptians by killing some of their property. So that's God's perspective. And those are the types of things, if this is a human being writing this who has that attitude about people in that time, understandable. But if you really think that this God actually does exist, I mean, you got to go, why was he doing this? That's crazy. And then you kind of have to ask the question, why is he sending Moses to do this warning? Why is he sending him when he knows he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart? And I say this a lot, but anytime you zoom out a little bit, everything just becomes some sort of weird theater, right? All of this is part of God's plan so that he can ultimately kill some slave girls' kids. That's what he wants to do. That's his end goal. That is going to happen. Why don't you just do it, God? Just go ahead and do it. You know what I mean? You don't need the whole play. You know, I know it makes for an interesting story. If we had any sort of objectivity as the people involved here, I would just go, just kill them. Just do what you're going to do. Why drag it out? Who are you doing that for? For us? You just end up looking like a dick. Then we go on to chapter 12, and that was a long chapter. It has a lot to do with eating roast lamb. I feel like it was the Hebrew people were eating their roast lamb, and they loved it. I mean, they did a great job. This was absolutely delicious. And they were like, I love this roast lamb. It's so delicious. Honestly, I really genuinely feel like this is a religious experience. And then they made it one, you know what I mean? And I love pitas. Can we make it, make the whole festival about pitas, It's just they really are passionate about their food, and some cultures are like that, and so they create some sort of festival around it. I think I sort of touched on it at the time, but in verse 12, when God says he's going to bring judgment on the gods of Egypt, it really does sound like that this God believes that there are other gods. I should say it this way. The people writing this book believed in other gods. They did not just believe that Yahweh was the only God. They did believe that their God was the big cheese. He was the biggest God. And honestly, I'm not really convinced that the people who wrote this book actually believed in this God, because they are also the ones writing the narrative. And there's a very good chance that they did not experience this. These were just myths of their culture at the time. So maybe they did or didn't believe in these gods, but these were their stories. In these stories, there is more than one God. There are many gods. These obviously lesser gods of Egypt, and then their God Yahweh, or whatever his name was at the time. But I think it's important to note that this religion doesn't seem like a monotheistic religion, okay? Christianity loves to sell itself as monotheistic, but it really genuinely doesn't seem to start that way. You would never judge a God that doesn't exist. You never send judgment on something that's not real. That just doesn't make sense. So they must believe that this is true, that these gods exist. It's very important if you're a Christian just to be like, okay, so this religion wasn't always monotheistic. And if you're fine with that, then that's cool. But if you really were hoping that you were part of a monotheistic religion, you're not. So in chapter 12, God has a huge problem with yeast. He hates yeast. It's weird, the level that he hates yeast. My sister told me yeast causes bread to spoil. It also takes longer for the bread to rise, so they were in a rush. So practically, yeast wasn't a very good thing to use in that moment. And we actually see that in verse 39. It says that the dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. And at the time, I was like, well, no, that's not why it didn't have yeast. They were commanded not to have yeast. So why would they put yeast in there when they were told no yeast? But it seems like an anachronism, really. It seems like the festival already existed when they were writing this down. They went back and said, okay, God is commanding these things during the Passover, don't have yeast, blah, 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 blah. And the reason why we don't use yeast is because we didn't have time to do the yeast. So it seems like the festival is informing the command, which is informing the festival. You know what I mean? Also, I have it on good authority, and I don't know where the verse is, that eventually yeast is going to be described as sin. And I do not know how that works. Honestly, I feel like that's a little bit of a stretch, but okay. Yeast is possibly sin. So in chapter 12, of course, we have the big moment of the Passover, and of course, it's kind of brutal with blood smeared on the doorway. It's probably going to stink in that desert with the heat, you know. God wasn't going to know who it was in those little houses in Goshen at the time, you know, unless, of course, there was blood on the doorway. That's the only way he could have known. I mean, he couldn't have pulled down their pants and checked for foreskin, I guess. I mean, you know, why not, you know, just sneak it, just say, everyone sleep naked, and I'll just check under the covers, and okay, yeah, that's one of mine. That would have been gross, you know, and a little bit, well, God's into that, you know, don't judge. He's a little bit kinky, but, you know, I think it would have been nicer compared to how it actually went. One thing that's worth observing in Exodus 12, verse 25 is propaganda again. I've sort of lightened up on it, but if you play back Genesis, you'll see a lot of propaganda there, and it's continuing. And it's kind of, you get numb to it after a while. But here he's saying, when you enter the land the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. So the propaganda of these people, where it's like, we're giving you this land. We're going to get this land. We will have a home. There will be a place. We are going to get it. This is going to be ours. This is all a lot of great motivation to like get the people really jazzed up about taking over some land. And I don't know if it's going to motivate them to commit genocides and things like that. I'm not sure if any of that did actually happen or if these are all just stories. It might just be even a motivator for the narrative, right? Like a prophecy, a magical element to allow for these stories of the war god. So in Exodus 13, there is more spelling out of this covenant, which stems, I believe, from the Passover. So in this case, it's more kill your own son, kill the donkey. Oh, just joking, you can redeem those things with a lamb. You know, you would have to kill your son. You would have to kill donkeys. But luckily, I've got the lamb redemption plan where you don't actually have to kill your son. You don't actually have to kill that donkey. Did the people of Canaan, people who became Israelites, did they actually ever follow through and kill a child? I mean, we see Abraham was commanded to do that. He didn't end up doing it in the narrative. But is there any kind of record, or do we have reason to believe that these ancient Israelites, who were at one time Canaanites, did they sacrifice babies? You can Google that. And if you're really honest, you might not like what you find. There is a good chance that you might find that the people here who are saying you can redeem children didn't always redeem children. But I do want to reiterate that there is a lot about yeast in this chapter as well. There is just more yammering on about yeast. And that brings me back to my point that if there is something omitted from the Bible, don't say that he just won't, God can't put everything in there. He can't put everything in there because he spent 3 paragraphs on yeast. That's why he can't put everything in there, okay? He could have put don't have slaves in there if he just had cut some of the yeast crap out of there, all right? So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Should we be sleeping with children? Well, let me just talk about yeast for a little while longer. I'll get to the kids. Let me talk about yeast a little while longer. In this chapter, I reacted to breaking a donkey's neck. That's really barbaric. And the amount of killing of animals that God wants these people to do. Like, he really wants a lot of bloodshed. He loves it. He's crazy about it. He wants to see pools of blood all over the place. And I get comments, and I've heard this many times, who are we to question God? Who are we to say under an atheistic or a non-believer worldview that this is wrong. You can't say anything is wrong if you don't have a moral standard, and you guys have heard this. Can't we look back at other cultures and say, hey, I would not like that if that were today. I would not want that in my culture now. And therefore, by extension, I don't think that would have been very good then. They were killing animals for no good reason. They thought there was a God, and they thought that God would be appeased by brutally killing animals. And I don't want to see that happening in my world today. If somebody was doing that next door to me, I would be horrified. I would not want to look. I would find it repulsive and repugnant and barbaric. So if I look in the past, am I allowed to say, oh, that's awful? Who are we to say that was wrong when we do not have a moral standard? I get the argument there. But I would say that it's worse for a believer because they believe that there's an immutable God. They believe that this God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. They believe this God can't change and that this God's morality doesn't change. So that means that this God loved the killing of animals and thought it was important and that was really valuable and that should happen and that was good. Why does he not still see that? Oh, because we had the human sacrifice to solve that. We don't need that anymore. Yeah, but he would still probably like it. Like if he liked it then, if he enjoyed that, I love the smell of burning flesh. I mean, maybe he just hangs out outside of a hamburger joint because he can smell the barbecue. But I get that there's some sort of weird change, even though he doesn't change in how he approaches sacrifice or whatever. I think that's a bigger problem for you because I can say, all right, that was them at a time. They thought it made sense. We can't really judge them too harshly. But now, of course, you would never do something like that. But for you, you've got a God who should be consistent. And he's not, because today what we do to please that God is vastly different from back then. And so you have to somehow imagine that the people are so vastly different, they couldn't understand anything, except that you want us to read the thing that the people wrote as a standard for us to live by today. You kind of want your cake and eat it too. I don't think that makes that much sense. Now, at the end of chapter 13, we see that God directs the Israelites away from the Philistines so that they don't get into a skirmish, so they don't get into a fight, because that might just make these Israelites kind of depressed. They just left and now they have to fight someone. So he brings them over to the Red Sea, and that, of course, is to set up for chapter 14. One thing we do have to keep in mind is that God has a tool belt. Okay, he's got a tool belt that is not unlike Batman's tool belt. He has things in his tool belt that we know now that he could be using. And the thing that I'm thinking of, favorably disposing the Egyptians to giving the Hebrews all his stuff. So now, infringing on free will and favorably disposing someone is in God's tool belt. And it seems like a very unintrusive way of getting people to do things, right? And so he could do this anytime he wants. I don't know if you guys know this story, but it was certainly a story that was in, I believe, may have happened in Canada, but it was a story I heard about a police officer who was charged because they pulled the wrong weapon. They pulled a gun when they should have pulled a taser, and they got in deep trouble for it. And they argued that they went for the taser, but it was in the wrong place, and somehow they took the gun out, and they ended up killing someone. We have built into our justice system, when people are in positions of authority, we want that force to be justified. So if they have in their tool belt a tool that is not going to be lethal, that will solve the problem, we want them to use that tool. So now we know that God in his tool belt has favorably disposing people, okay? That is something that he can do. If we really wanted to avoid killing all of the Egyptians, he could have sent the Israelites past Philistia, made them favorably disposed to being friendly with them, maybe giving them something to eat and drink and having a nice time, and then moving on. And this would have been the path of least resistance. Based on our morality and the way that we see the world, we believe that if you're in a position of authority, you should use the least harmful method to get what you want. Now, of course, what God wanted, again, is that all the Egyptians would be killed so that he would be remembered in Egypt. He wasn't remembered in Egypt because he killed all the people that could have possibly remembered what he did. So God fails. God is barbaric. God doesn't even match the morality that we share today in our world, which is better than his. So Exodus 14, of course, is super famous. It's the story of the Red Sea parting. It's very funny that God is doing all of this so that he can be remembered forever in Egypt. And we do not see that he was remembered at all in Egypt. And also, it makes sense why. Because he just totally destroyed anyone that might actually remember what happened. I'm actually kind of impressed by the set pieces that the Bible is bringing to us. The Red Sea, the plagues, Egypt, the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. There's a lot of really cool imagery that's happening. And the storytelling is certainly improving from like Genesis, which was absolute garbage. But it does make it all feel very, very fictional, you know? Because if God were consistent, if God were unchanging, which he is supposed to be, would we really see such variation in his approach? Flood, a worldwide flood, then we'd see sulfur raining down from heaven, then we'd see a famine, which some people would say that he didn't do that, but what are you talking about? We see plagues, and then we see the parting of the Red Sea. There's a lot of different variation in how he's doing things, which makes for good stories, but also feels like it's just trying to make for a good story, you know what I mean? Because it could just be similar to the Onan and Ur thing I mentioned earlier. Like, he just killed them. So he could do that, right? And now I'm going to get back at all these Egyptians. How? Just by killing them all. Just like now they're all dead. You know, I did the Passover thing. It seems like an arbitrary sort of test or something like that, where you guys have to paint your doorways. Okay, why? Anyway, okay. It's a cool set piece. It's a kind of a cool thing that happens. And then he kills the firstborns. Fine. He could have just killed them, right? Like, he could have just, boop, they're done. It all feels very much like just fun stories. Just having things happen in such a fun way to make it noteworthy so that it's somewhat of a fun read, which, by the way, it's not that fun of a read. But that's something else to take into consideration. When we look at how God performs things. And I mentioned it with the plagues where Moses had to throw up some dust or whatever, and that became a cloud, and then it became gnats or something. I forget, locusts or something. I don't remember. And if you look at the Noah account, you can read how sort of physical that was. The waters came up and were blown and moved and, rain. So it could just be that this God isn't really as outside of space and time as we'd like him to be. He may actually have to use these elements in order to do what he wants to do, which is, of course, kill people. But he might just need all this magic to be able to make it work. That is the other option. He may not be all-powerful on the level that we imagine all-powerful to be. He might just be very powerful. So in chapter 15, you guys got to hand it to me. I sang that whole chapter. I mean, be honest, it was pretty impressive. That was a good one. Don't you think? That was pretty smart. But in that chapter, they sing a lot about how God is going to terrify all these other nations. They will all tremble for the Lord. Spoiler alert, in a few chapters, they end up trembling because the Lord is sending smoke, thunder, and lightning, and trumpets down from Mount Sinai. right? And they're all like, "Ah," and he's like, I'm going to kill you if you touch the base of the mountain. God is making everyone terrified, not just other nations. Israel is so cocky. They're like, he's our God. He's going to make everyone scared. Oh, no, not us, So I made a joke about the 12 springs and 70 palm trees that were in Elim. I've heard that there were 2 million people that came out of Egypt. I don't know why they would mention the tiniest amount of palm trees and springs for 2 million people. I think it might be that these are a nomadic tribe, relatively illiterate, who just don't know what 2 million people or 600,000 people in a throng would look like. That's a lot of people for 70 palm trees. I just think they might not be able to picture that, and that's fine. It just again shows that this is written of a time is a little bit ridiculous to believe as actual fact. So in chapter 16, we get the miracle of manna and quail from heaven, but there's only going to be enough for one day. Do not take more than your share. Well, you can't. Magically, you can't take more than your share, but also do not keep any. I wonder why God requires a test of trust like this. I know that there's a lot of tests of trust, some that people extrapolate from the text, and then others like this that do seem a little bit more explicit in the text. But why does God require that? And arguably still does. With the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Why doesn't God give us security? Why doesn't God give us always enough bread and water? We never ran out. We just had it. So no more starvation in the world. What's the value of this test? What does God want from us? He's already hiding himself, so we can't know that he exists. So he's testing us in that way, and he's testing us by not giving us the things that we need. And there's millions of people every year, like 3 million people, who die of starvation. Why? What is the point? What's the point of needing to trust this God who doesn't always follow through? It would solve all of the wars for resources, right? It would solve world starvation, obviously. We would just not have to worry about that, and we could get on with worrying about whether or not this God actually exists, although we would have some sort of evidence for it, because we'd be like, oh yeah, we're always provided for. Actually, thank God. Actually thank that God, because he's actually doing something for once. Somebody actually mentioned that the reason why God just does a little bit at a time is to develop a relationship. I had a similar relationship because I had a little chipmunk. I might have like 5 peanuts on me, but I'd only show that I have 1 peanut at a time. So I would get him to keep coming back for the peanut so that he would trust me, so that he would know that I'm not going to hurt him, so that I could start getting little pets in. Now, he didn't understand what was going on. He couldn't understand it because he's a chipmunk and I'm a person. But is that any kind of relationship? If you think about it, and I don't want to be the bad guy here, but kind of like grooming a chipmunk, not giving the chipmunk anything for its own sake, but because I want to pet the chipmunk and I want the chipmunk to trust me because I think it's cute, and I want to feel like I have a pet. But I think that that's what God does, is he made us little chipmunks and bribes us with certain things so that we'll be his cute little pets. And hey, look, if you think that's love or you think that that's a relationship, go for it. But come on. It's about as much of a relationship as I had with that chipmunk. So in verse 8, we get a really funny verse where Moses says, hey, look, don't grumble at me when there's not enough to eat. Grumble at the Lord. It seems to me, since this is a fiction, that the leaders who probably wrote this were kind of like saying, hey, this is a good point. Have the people blame this invisible nothing God that doesn't exist. And so we actually don't have to take the blame. It's God. Grumble at him. So it's actually a really clever thing for these leaders to have done. Then there was a part where they take some of the manna in remembrance and put it in a jar. And that manna keeps so that they can like show that this happened. Imagine we still had that. Boy, that would change everything. It's real. Do you realize what would happen if we had that level of evidence? Like if you think about those things, you go, oh, we really don't have any evidence. Like we have nothing. Like, there's nothing here to show for it. But it would be pretty cool if there was manna. So in chapter 17, then we get the famous story of Moses holding up his hands so that Joshua wins the battle. We needed this to be interesting, but we didn't want to describe the full battle because that would have taken too much time. So what kind of beautiful, magical, supernatural sort of thing can we add to this to make the story a little bit more interesting? Okay, well, we'll have this old man hold up his hands. We also love Moses. He's our main guy. Aaron's our main guy. But we know that we can't really have them down there wielding swords because they are too old for that now. So we can have them holding up hands, and that's going to actually help the battle, but they don't have to do anything super actively. So we still have an old man winning a battle, but we didn't have to have him fight. And that's a clever way of involving these main characters. So then we have chapter 18 where Moses' wife comes to see him with the father-in-law. And I guess at some point the wife disappeared from this story. It seems like what should have happened is their kids should have been removed for child abuse. There was an emergency circumcision, just the wife acting absolutely unhinged, doing a quick cutting off her kid's foreskin really, really fast. That's not healthy. But what probably actually happened was Zipporah, who doesn't know Yahweh, she probably was like, okay, their God is going to swoop down and try to kill Moses at any time, might kill me, might kill my kids. So I'm going to leave to keep them safe because this God is crazy. And I don't want to be around next time he loses his mind. So, I think I'm going to go stay with my dad for a while, Moses. I think I'm going to stay with my dad. So people are coming to Moses to judge their issues and tell them what they should be doing. And Moses is kind of judging them based on laws that don't exist yet. He knows the laws, he knows the decrees, but this is before they've received them. So I don't know where he's getting these ideas. Maybe he just knows them. Maybe God wrote them on his heart. Who knows? In verse 21, we get this line, select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gains. I wish that this was still the rule, that God or any sort of church leaders or anyone actually put people in charge who hate dishonest gain. Because what we do see a lot of the time is people who want dishonest gain and who love dishonest gain and dishonestly gain in churches, of course in our governments, but definitely in churches. So that is a good rule that I think churches should actually try to uphold. And I want to go to verse 12 where it says, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. It's really hard to know what that means. Like, we can understand what a burnt offering is, and we also know what it would mean to eat bread. But in the presence of God, this is a term that isn't very clear. How does that work? Where is God's presence? What does that feel like? What does it look like? Is he there? Do we know he's there? And I think that this is something that we probably will be able to notice throughout this book, which is we have very practical, very real world things like yeast. Don't use yeast. Don't have any yeast in your house. There must not be yeast. Or go stone this person. I want all of you to come together and stone this person to death. But when it gets to these spiritual sort of ethereal sort of notions where we were eating in the presence of God, it's like, what is that though? What does that mean? What does it look like? And there is no answer to it. It's really just not that obvious what that could possibly mean. So we have a real world and we interact in the real world, and you and I know what that real world is like. But this spiritual world is incredibly distant and kind of unattainable. We can't really fully conceptualize what these things are. It's just words, right? All it is right now is words. And you can put words in the comments to tell me what that would possibly mean in the presence of God. What does it feel like? What does it look like? Honestly, what does it mean in any sort of practical terms? So chapter 19 starts with, in the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the... Now, I don't know if there's significance to that very day, but my best guess is even when they left 430 years to the day, that those numbers, even though if you add 4 and 3 together, it's 7, those numbers are kind of just making it seem like they're significant. You know, it's like, we met 5 months ago to the day. It's like, I guess that means something. I don't know. It just seems like it's a way for writers to make something feel more substantial than it really is. Like, who really cares? So in verse 8, it says that the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." And Moses brought that answer back to God. It is insane that Moses needed to bring the answer back to God. Why does Moses have to tell God anything? This goes back to Genesis 18, where God has to come down and check something out. What is the point of Moses going back? And you guys are going to be like, oh, it's anthropomorphic. God needs Moses to feel like he's having a conversation. What, really? Why does Moses need that? Why do we not need it? Have we really advanced that much that we can get our heads around, oh, God is all-knowing, but Moses just didn't know that, so he had to come down, tell the Israelites stuff, and then go back and go, God, they said this, and he's like, okay, thanks. It's again, a really weird moment of theater where it's like, yeah, okay, what did you want to tell me? No, I know what they said, you know? It's just not consistent with what people want to say this God's attributes are. So I think I mentioned it when I was reading this chapter, but verse 9, I want to reiterate, is so important. Moses being the guy, like God is saying, these people must have infallible trust in you, so that your word will be my word. And I think he even said this, I will speak through you, back at the burning bush, but that was to Pharaoh. But he's kind of doubling down here, going like, hey, you are my messenger, you are my prophet, everyone must trust you implicitly. This is important because there are apologetics that are going to come up where Moses was giving his own law, and that the law was flawed. This wasn't God's law, this was Moses' law. But God is making Moses his guy. He's creating this unquestionable trust through these actions. So if anything in this book is to be believed, which it shouldn't be, you got to take this one on as well. And you got to go, okay, I guess what he tells Moses and what Moses says is basically gospel. So then God wants people to be stoned or shot with arrows if they dare to try to look at him and come up the mountain. I'm like, is he the Phantom of the Opera? Does he have a burnt face or something like that? Is he deformed? Why is God so shy? Why is he so nervous? Why can nobody look at him except for Jacob and Abraham and Adam? You know, why can no one look at God except for all these other people? He might be an ugly guy. He might just be really unattractive. I think Jesus was probably hot, but God is probably just, he's probably got like 50,000 eyeballs on his head or something like that. He's probably grotesque. The thing is, he's shown so much power, you know, with the splitting of the Red Sea and all the plagues and everything like that. And yet he's going to force his people to enact his revenge. I mean, we're going to see in the future, it says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay it. And yet that's not true. He wants you to do it. If somebody does this, they must be shot with arrows and they have to have rocks thrown at them. And the other thing to note, and I think I've said this in one of the episodes, God's justice, the justice God wants to enact is of that time. And you'll see this throughout this whole thing. He's never outside of this time period, right? Everything he does exists within the imagination of these people. He never progresses anything beyond what they would probably know, right? He doesn't have any more scientific knowledge in like the creation story, whatever. And he doesn't have some sort of better, more humane way to kill someone, because the best they've figured out is that we can throw stones at people until they die, or of course shoot arrows, which is probably the more expensive of the two. But really, why does he need people to do that when he is super powerful? I don't know. I don't know why he requires that of his people. I don't know why he wants them to kill people. I don't know what it is about him watching other people do his killing that gets him off so much. But for some reason, he really, really, really likes it. Just think about that. Think about you having to do that. You know, your brother touched the foot of the mountain. Just imagine that. I gotta get these rocks and pummel you with them because God can't kill you on his own, which would be easier for me because I really now have to watch myself kill you, and this is actually going to destroy me emotionally. It does seem like in those moments, just in those moments, that God literally has no power in this realm. So then in chapter 20, we get the 10 Commandments, one of the big ones. We get the first set of 10 commandments, and I only say that because I know that there's going to be another set. So I'm sorry, I know things. I know I'm not supposed to know them, but I know them, okay? So right away in verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, the land of slavery. Now, if we know going forward that there is going to be slavery in the land, that the Hebrews are going to have slavery, isn't the Hebrews' land a land of slavery? Isn't Canaan going to be a land of slavery? Isn't Israel going to just be another land of slavery? Egypt is the land of their slavery, but they are going to be the land of someone else's slavery. It is weird to keep on going on about how Egypt is the land of slavery when God is kind of guaranteeing, based on Exodus 12:44 and Genesis 17, and then we're going to move forward to future verses, that Israel will be a land of slavery. Verse 5 and 6, we see that God is going to punish the children for the sin of their fathers to the third and fourth generations. He reiterates this in Deuteronomy, but showing love to thousands of generations to those who love me and keep my commandments. Is this just? That's the question. I had a discussion with someone in my comments about this, and they were saying that the curse is actually something that is just happens. It's just the way of the world. That if you hate God, it won't go well for you, and that will progress into generations. When God shows love to 1,000 generations, is that real, or is that just like if you love God, thousands of generations? That's 40,000 years later, your people will still be doing well because God will love. 40,000 years. There's got to be someone of these people who loved God and is still, their generations are like enjoying this because it has not been 40,000 years since this happened, right? So there's got to be people that just have just gone strength to strength because they're just like a very loved by God family, right? I don't know where they are. I don't know who they are, but if you're one of them, if you're one of the blessed generations, let us know. And you know how God is supposed to be just, and the reason why God had to kill himself for himself on the cross was out of justice. That is one of the arguments. And he can't not do it because he's pure justice, and he can't undermine justice. But if you really push for it, the description of justice is just whatever he thinks is just. I'm not going to digress into that right now. But is it really just to punish anyone for someone else's crimes? Ever? I don't think that based on this, that God is very just. But the other thing that is actually almost more important, he says here that he's going to show love to 1,000 generations of those who love him. But this is like the first mention of God loving us. And the only reason he's going to love us is because we loved him. He's going to show love if we do it first. This is the opposite of agape love. Like, please notice this. I don't know if there's another mention of love before this. I don't think there is. And I don't know when we start seeing this idea that God loved us first and that because of that, we should love him. At least for the people who were getting this law and were understanding God at this time, they would have had to see God as someone or something that would love them only if they loved him first. Whatever other notion that you have was not around at this time. So we really have to get up to verse 12 to have anything that's really that interesting. And I talked about it at the time. The 10 Commandments, the first 4 or however many that are all about the Sabbath and God and stuff are kind of useless to us. And then honoring your mother and your father, I would say honor them if they are honorable, then they may receive honor. But other than that, don't bother. It's a waste of your time. So when you get to verse 20, you got to go, these are lousy, very skint. Like there's not enough commandments, or there's a lot of useless commandments. It seems like this is not the best we've got. And then you're mentioning slaves, but you're not saying don't have slaves. I would put that in there, especially if that was a problem in that time. Were there more people owning slaves or more people committing murders? If there was more people owning slaves, mention it. You know what I mean? Was there more people sleeping with children than there were killing? Probably. That's happening today. There's way more molestation happening, I'm sure. I have not even Googled this, but I know there's way more molestation happening in this day and age than there is murder. Okay? We need that commandment. If these commandments are worth anything and they're going to stop anyone from doing anything, then let's put in there, don't have sex with children and don't keep slaves. They're not hard. He could have said them anywhere in the book. They're certainly not in this chapter. Hopefully, eventually he'll get around to mentioning it. If he can just shut up about yeast for a second, he can start talking about the things that we actually don't want people doing. We don't want people murdering, but I don't think it's as big of a problem as he might have thought at the time. But if we read verse 20, Moses says to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you and keep you from sinning." Let's stop with this religion is based on anything other than fear, okay? There's no reason to say this anymore. It's right here, black and white. The mention of love in this chapter, as I stated earlier, says that you've got to love me before I love you, and I need you to fear me so that you behave. And that's all this is. That's all that's happening. All of this is useless because it's not really stopping anyone from doing anything, and it's not really giving any rules that are necessary. And if it did, it wouldn't move the needle or change anyone anyway. So we might as well just throw it out because it doesn't work on any level whatsoever. If you do still want to sit there and go, these are the pinnacle of morality by this incredible, true, objectively moral God, well, he's a failure and they suck. And there's really not much to them that we can sink our teeth into. Anyway, I've gone on way too long with this. Guys, this is the recap. I know this was a really long recap, and I'm so sorry. And I don't even know if it was that interesting. But thanks for watching if you watched the whole way. We'll be back next time with Exodus 21. I want to thank everyone here that subscribes, likes my videos, and comments on them. It means a lot. The community is growing. The channel is growing, and I appreciate you all being here. People have gone back and watched from the very beginning, and I get comments from them adding jokes or different sort of things to think about as they go through the episodes. And that's really what this channel is here for, so that you can read the Bible with me, enjoy it, have fun, and sort of think critically about it on some level as well. And so thank you for doing that. And thank you for joining me on this journey. We will see you next time, and have a beautiful, beautiful day or night. Bye.